terms have a lot of invisible parts to it, and it's very common for people when they see the terms to, since they don't see the invisible parts, to just assume they're not there. So we're going to go over the parts here that are invisible so that you will know what's there, because they affect how you're going to solve problems. So here is a term. Can you tell me what the invisible parts of this term are? All right, let's look at it. Is that what you wanted to write? So as we can see, there are a lot of different parts here. We've got the sign, we've got a coefficient, we've got two exponents, and we even have a multiplication sign. So let's go ahead and go through this. If we look at multiplication in a term, what does 3y mean? It means that we have 3 y's and they're being added together. Now, again, if we look here, 3 times 2, well, that means the same thing. We have 3 2's and they are being added together. That's what multiplication is, repeated addition. Here we have 4 times 5, which again are 4 5's that are being added together. And then lastly, again, another example, 4r, that means we have 4 r's. Here we have to write the multiplication symbol because otherwise we would just think, oh, this is the number 32. So we have to write it here. We don't have to write it here because we know that this is a coefficient and this is a variable. And since multiplication is the default operation in math, which means if we know there's an operation happening, but there's no sign to tell us what it is, then it's multiplication. And we'll look at what some of those options are or some of those examples are in a second. So here are different ways that we can write multiplication. The most common way that you're taught as a child when they first introduce multiplication to you, for example, is 3 times by 2, and there's an x in there. Now, this can be confusing because if you look at it, when we get into multiplication or get into algebra and we start having variables, what is the most common variable? Well, it's an x. And so if we're doing 3 times x, it's confusing. So that's why once you get up to algebra, we stop writing the x and we start writing it as a dot, 3 times x. And again, here we don't even have to write the multiplication because we can just write 3x. The reason why we don't use an x for multiplication when we get to algebra is because it's too confusing and people would probably think they wouldn't know when it's a variable or when it's multiplication. So that's why it's important at this point to stop writing an x and start writing a dot when you have to reference multiplication. Another example of multiplication is when you have a number outside of parentheses. This right here is 3 times 2, okay? The 3 is next to the 2, and these parentheses are here so you won't think that the number is 32. And so here, since it's outside the parentheses, we don't have to write the multiplication symbol that would be right there. And same thing with if we have 4 times by 5 plus 2. Again, this right here, because it's outside and there's nothing in between it, there's that invisible multiplication sign here. So this is 4 times by 5 plus 2. Okay, so these are some examples of how you would see multiplication. You've got the x, you have the dot, you have it outside of parentheses, you have it outside of parentheses, okay? And we don't have to write the multiplication dot there. So, when is multiplication invisible? When it is in between a coefficient and a variable, When it's in between a number and a variable and parentheses, and when it is between two or more variables. Here's some examples. If you have 3x, y, there are invisible multiplication signs here between all of this. So this is really just 3 times by x times by y. Does that make sense? Here with the parentheses again, if we have, you can have 3 times by 4 plus x, or you could have x times by 4 minus y. Okay? Just putting random variables here, but in both of these cases, there's a variable right outside the parentheses, so that means it's multiplication. Here we've got a 3 outside, and that means it's multiplication. Here we've just got 3xy, and there's an invisible multiplication there. All right, so let's review. We've got multiplication. Multiplication is the default operation in math. So if you know that there's an operation happening, but there's nothing written there, it's multiplication. So you'll see it in between a coefficient and a variable. You will also see it in between two or more variables. Again, if you have 3x, y, r, z, we have invisible multiplication signs in between each one of these. And when you see a number or a variable that is outside parentheses, that is also multiplication. Okay?